Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're always up for a good intellectual challenge here, and today is no exception. We're going deep, really deep, into the world of Chilean philosophy, specifically its development during the 19th and 20th centuries.
Yeah, buckle up because we're diving headfirst into some pretty complex stuff, our main source for this deep dive. Well, it's the 19th and 20th century Chilean philosophy entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
That's right, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, always a great resource. And look, I know this might sound a little academic maybe, but trust me, it's way more fascinating than you might think.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we're aiming for, right? To really get a grasp on how philosophical thought unfolded in Chile, how it was unique, and how it was so deeply intertwined with all the social and political shifts happening there. Totally. I mean, think about it. We're going to trace the evolution of ideas, the rise and fall of different schools of thought, the influence of major historical events. It's all connected, you know. We'll be looking at the academic roots, the big philosophical movements like positivism, the impact of political upheaval, and just the ongoing conversation between philosophy and society.
And to give you a sense of the journey ahead, we'll start with, kind of the pre-independence scene, the philosophical backdrop. Then we'll move into how philosophy took shape in the newly formed republic. Then we'll dive into the rise of positivism and its impact on Chilean thought. Of course, no philosophical movement goes unchallenged, so we'll look at the reactions against positivism.
And then we'll explore this idea of philosophical professionalism, its emergence, its critiques, and how it all played out. And finally, we can't talk about 20th century Chile without addressing the military regime and its really profound impact on philosophical life, the universities, the whole intellectual landscape.
Yeah, it's going to be a wild ride through history and ideas.
Okay, so let's get started. Now, while we're mainly focusing on the 19th and 20th centuries, we need to kind of acknowledge that there was, a whole intellectual scene in Chile even before independence in 1818. It's not like philosophy just appeared out of thin air.
Yeah, definitely. During the Spanish colonial period, you see philosophical discussions happening, but they were mostly confined to academic and religious circles. And these two spheres were often pretty intertwined. Take, for example, the Dominican convent in Santiago, which was a hub of intellectual activity.
So we're talking scholasticism, right? That whole medieval tradition of rigorous logic and reasoning, but often within a very theological framework.
Yeah, that's it. A lot of emphasis on Aristotle and, working through theological problems using philosophical tools. And there were some key figures who shaped those early discussions. You have Cristobal de Valdespino, who is deeply rooted in the scholastic tradition.
Then a bit later, in the 17th and early 18th centuries, we see a bunch of clergymen engaging in philosophical debates. Alonso Briceño, Miguel de Viñas, Manuel Ovalle, Manuel Antonio Talavera. They wrote a lot, mostly from that scholastic perspective, tackling those big theological questions.
Right. They were asking questions like, what's the nature of God? What's the relationship between faith and reason? What's the soul? Classic stuff.
But then something big happens. 1767, the expulsion of the Jesuits. How did that event change the direction of philosophy in Chile?
It was a huge turning point, definitely. Many Jesuit intellectuals, thinkers like Miguel de Olivares, Felipe Gómez de Vidor, Juan Ignacio Molina, and Manuel Lacunza were forced to leave Chile and publish their work elsewhere. And this geographical shift kind of brought about a change in focus.
So before the expulsion, philosophy in Chile was very much centered on theological issues, right?
Yeah, heavily theological. But these exiled thinkers, they started to show more interest in practical matters, the specific realities of the New World. They engaged less with purely theological debates and more with the challenges and opportunities of this new environment.
It's like we see a very early form of national consciousness emerging, even before independence, finding expression in philosophical thought.
I think you're spot on there. There's a shift toward thinking about what it means to be in this new world, a move away from purely European concerns.
Were there any other intellectuals at the time bridging this colonial era with the upcoming independence movement who sort of exemplified this transition?
Yeah, absolutely. You have lay authors like Manuel de Salas and Juan Egaña. They were engaging with Enlightenment ideas, reason, individual rights, more secular view of the world.
So they're like the philosophical bridge, connecting the late colonial period with the intellectual currents that would fuel the drive for independence.
Yeah, they lay the groundwork.
Yeah.
And you can see the seeds of liberal thought starting to sprout.
Okay, so then independence is achieved in 1818, and this marks the real beginning of what we can call Chilean philosophy, right? There's a conscious effort to cultivate philosophical thought, especially in higher education, with this clear national purpose.
Exactly. With the independent republic, philosophy starts being developed more systematically within universities because these institutions are now seen as vital for nation building.
But there's an immediate challenge, one that many newly independent nations face: figuring out the relationship between the church and the state.
Right. Catholicism was declared the official religion, and that had a big impact on how people thought about and did philosophy.
So how did philosophers, many of whom were themselves Catholic, navigate this situation where they had to engage with secular ideas that might even challenge church doctrine?
It was a delicate balancing act. They had to find ways to discuss these new ideas, like the skepticism of someone like Hume, without being seen as attacking the faith.
It must have led to some pretty interesting intellectual gymnastics.
Oh, definitely. They were constantly trying to reconcile these different perspectives, pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable within the framework of Catholicism.
So where did they do their philosophizing, so to speak?
Well, a major avenue became secondary school textbooks. These textbooks were seen as a way to shape the minds of the next generation of Chileans.
But there was a catch, right?
Of course. These textbooks had to be improved by the government, and that meant passing muster with the Catholic Church.
So while philosophical ideas were reaching a wider audience, they were also being carefully filtered.
Yeah, there was a limit to what you could say. A striking example is Francisco Bilbao's book, Sociabilidad Chilena. It was deemed too radical, too critical of the church, and it was actually publicly burned for being blasphemous and immoral.
Wow, talk about censorship. That really highlights the power dynamics at play and just how sensitive people were about philosophical ideas.
Absolutely. Ideas mattered, and they could be dangerous.
So, within this constrained environment, were there any significant philosophical contributions? We have to talk about Andres Bello, a major figure of this period.
Bello was a fascinating character. He lived from 1781 to 1865, and he was deeply engaged with the ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment, thinkers like Reid, Brown, and Stewart.
But at the same time, he was a devout Catholic.
Right, he was very much a believer. And his major work, Filosofía del Entendimiento, it's all about how we acquire knowledge, a deep dive into psychology and logic. It was published posthumously in 1881, but parts of it were circulating in the 1840s.
What were some of his key ideas?
He was really focused on the process of acquiring ideas. He divided it into psychology, which dealt with the origins of ideas, and logic, which looked at how we use those ideas to reason and act. He engaged with empiricists like Locke and Berkeley, but also offered his own critiques. What's interesting is that while his work didn't have a huge immediate impact in Chile, it became quite influential in other Latin American countries in the 20th century.
And it's one of the few works by a Latin American philosopher to be fully translated into English, right?
Yeah, which speaks to its importance. Now, in contrast to Bello's more secular approach, you have Ramón Briceño, whose Curso de Filosofía Moderna, published in the mid-1840s, was explicitly aligned with Catholic doctrine.
So a more conservative approach to philosophy.
Definitely. Briceño believed that philosophy should ultimately lead to Christian conclusions. In fact, he said that any philosophy that didn't was dangerous and false.
Wow, a pretty strong statement. That's a very different view of the purpose of philosophy compared to Bello's.
Yeah, fundamental difference. And Briceño's textbook was widely used in both public and private schools, so it had a big impact on how philosophy was taught.
Did Bello and Briceño ever directly engage with each other's work?
While Bello didn't completely reject religious belief, he did criticize Briceño's limited treatment of logic. Bello felt that Briceño focused too much on deductive reasoning and didn't give enough attention to other forms of logic.
So even in the context of textbook writing, we see this broader debate about the nature and scope of philosophy playing out. It's like a microcosm of the larger intellectual currents.
Exactly. Now, another key figure of this period is José Victorino Lastarria. He was more politically active than Bello or Briceño, advocating for liberal ideals.
He was involved in the Liberal Party, right?
Yeah, he actually founded it. He was also a prolific writer, using his work to spread liberal principles. He was very much influenced by Enlightenment thought and also by Argentine liberal thinkers like Sarmiento and Alberti.
Okay, so as we move into the latter half of the 19th century, we see the rise of a new philosophical force, positivism. This seems to be a major turning point, and it happens alongside a growing anti-clerical sentiment.
Positivism was a game changer. It emphasized scientific progress and a very empirical approach to knowledge. Comte, who was kind of the father of positivism, argued that humanity goes through three stages: theological, metaphysical, and finally, positive or scientific.
So the idea was that we're moving away from superstition and speculation toward a more rational, evidence-based understanding of the world.
Yeah, and this idea of scientific progress, of a society based on reason and observation, it really resonated with people who were critical of the church's influence.
It provided a justification for shifting power away from religious authority and toward a more secular approach to knowledge and social organization.
Exactly. And this had a huge impact on education. Positivism fueled major reforms in the curriculum at all levels.
So we're talking about a real shift in how people thought about education and the role of philosophy within it.
Yeah, a big shift. Even Lastaria, who had earlier been a proponent of liberalism, embraced positivism, believing that science held the key to solving societal problems.
And then there's Valentin Letelier, who's considered the central figure of Chilean positivism.
Letelier was incredibly influential. His book, Philosophie de la Education, laid the intellectual groundwork for a major reorientation of philosophical studies. He argued that the emphasis on theology and metaphysics in the past had failed to create a unified intellectual foundation for the country.
So he saw science as the great unifier.
Exactly. He believed that only the certainty of scientific knowledge could provide that common ground, and he championed logic as the primary tool for achieving this. He even managed to get logic included in the 1893 educational plan, but at the expense of subjects like ethics and theodicy.
It seems like a very science-centric view of philosophy. Were there any dissenting voices within positivism itself?
Interestingly, yes. While the mainstream of positivism in Chile focused on scientific methodology and social progress, there was a smaller, less influential group led by the Lagarde brothers, Juan Enrique and Jorge.
They were into Comte's later religion of humanity.
Yeah, they embraced this quasi-religious dimension of positivism with its rituals and its focus on humanity as the supreme being.
Yeah. But that version didn't really catch on in academic circles.
No, it didn't gain much traction. And politically, it became associated with authoritarianism, particularly with the administration of José Manuel Balmaceda.
Okay, so now we're in the early 20th century, and we see a reaction against this all-encompassing positivism. And the leader of this anti-positivist movement is Enrique Molina.
Molina's a really interesting figure. He was educated in the positivist tradition, but he became disillusioned with what he saw as its limitations. He felt that it had led to a stagnation of genuine philosophical inquiry.
So he was pushing back against the idea that science was the only valid way of knowing.
Yeah, he thought that positivism had gone too far in its rejection of metaphysics and the exploration of deeper questions about being and consciousness.
What were some of the thinkers who influenced him in this shift?
Well, he was really taken with the pragmatism of William James, the American philosopher, and even more so with the vitalism of Henri Bergson.
Bergson emphasized this idea of a life force, right? Something that went beyond purely mechanical explanations.
Yeah, that's it. And Molina felt that this vitalist perspective offered a way to reintroduce metaphysics into philosophical discussion, to explore the realm of the spiritual and the subjective.
And in his book, De lo espiritual en la vida humana, he argued that material progress hadn't necessarily led to greater happiness or a deeper understanding of the human condition.
Right. He was saying that science and technology had brought about many advancements, but they hadn't addressed the fundamental questions of meaning and purpose.
So he was calling for a return to the life of the spirit, though not necessarily in a religious sense.
Exactly. He saw philosophy as having a crucial role in this, in exploring the inner life and cultivating the values that make for a truly fulfilling human existence.
And his ideas resonated with other thinkers, both Catholic and secular.
Yeah, his critique of positivism struck a chord. Catholic thinkers like Clarence Finlayson were drawn to his emphasis on the spiritual dimension of human experience.
And secular thinkers like Jorge Milles, in his book Idea de la Individualidad, also pushed back against the limitations of positivism, emphasizing the importance of individual liberty and subjective experience.
It was a broad intellectual movement, a recognition that the purely scientific worldview wasn't enough.
This shift away from positivism must have also led to some changes within academic institutions, right?
Definitely. We see the creation of the Center for Philosophical Studies at the University of Chile in 1929. And then in 1931, there's a big university reform that brings the Pedagogical Institute, which was the main center for philosophical training, into the Faculty of Philosophy.
So philosophy is becoming more integrated into the university structure.
Right. And it's not just happening at the University of Chile. Philosophy is being taught at the universities of Concepcion and the Catholic University as well. The Catholic University even establishes an Academy of Philosophy. and expands its course offerings in metaphysics and ethics.
And all of this activity culminates in the founding of the Chilean Society of Philosophy in 1948 and the launch of the Revista de Filosofía in 1949.
Yeah, those were big milestones. They provided platforms for scholarly exchange and publication, really solidifying the professionalization of philosophy in Chile. And something else that happened during this period that's important to mention is the arrival of European philosophers as refugees from the Spanish Civil War and World War II.
So they brought new ideas and perspectives to Chilean philosophy, adding to the diversity of thought.
Exactly. Now, amidst all this growth and development, there's a growing consensus that philosophy should be an autonomous academic discipline, somewhat removed from direct political involvement.
So a focus on specialized research and engagement with international philosophical debates rather than on immediate social and political concerns.
Yeah, that's the prevailing view. Even though individual philosophers had their own political beliefs, the field itself was seen as operating within the university setting, focused on scholarship. And this era is often referred to as one of philosophical normalcy.
But of course, this philosophical normalcy wasn't going to last forever. In the 1950s and 60s, we see a growing critique of philosophical professionalism.
Right. While professional philosophy was flourishing, with all these new institutions and publications and international recognition, think the first International Congress of the Inter-American Society of Philosophy held in Santiago in 1956, with big names like Quine, Chisholm, and Bunge attending some philosophers, started to question whether it was truly relevant to the social and political realities of Chile.
It's like they were asking, what's the point of all this abstract theorizing if it's not addressing the real issues facing our country?
Yeah, that was the sentiment. And Juan Ravana was a particularly vocal critic of this trend. He felt that academic philosophy had become too abstract, too disconnected from the urgent problems of the day.
And he drew on his background in logic to challenge some of the assumptions of his colleagues, right?
Yeah, he questioned the conceptual consistency of some of their work. He felt that they were getting lost in their own abstractions. And he eventually turned toward Hegel and Marx, advocating for a more socially and economically critical philosophy.
So a philosophy that was more engaged with the specific historical and material conditions of Chile and Latin America?
Exactly. He wanted a philosophy that could speak to the struggles of the people.
How did the established philosophical community respond to Ravana's criticisms?
They largely rejected his views. They defended the idea of philosophical professionalism and argued that the university should be a space for free inquiry, shielded from the pressures of political and social demands.
So a kind of ivory tower mentality.
Yeah, you could say that. They resisted calls for university reform that would have pushed for a more socially engaged philosophy. And this despite the fact that the electorate was expanding and more people were gaining access to higher education.
It seems like a missed opportunity for philosophy to connect with a wider audience and make a real impact on society.
It's a debate that continues to this day. The balance between rigorous academic inquiry and social relevance. Now, within these professional circles, there were still dominant philosophical themes being explored. Engagement with phenomenology, especially the work of Heidegger, was still popular.
And the critique of modernity was a major theme, right?
Yeah, that was big. Jorge Millos, influenced by Ortega y Gasset, wrote a lot about the dangers of mass society. He emphasized the importance of spiritual and intellectual values over what he saw as the crass materialism of the modern world.
And he specifically warned against the rise of Marxism, right?
Yeah, he saw Marxism as a threat to individual liberty and the spiritual life. And he believed that the university had a vital role to play in resisting the homogenizing forces of mass society.
So he's defending a more traditional humanistic vision of culture and education.
Exactly. And other thinkers like Martinez Bonatti and Viola Rain echoed these concerns. They were worried about the decline of intellectual standards and the rise of a kind of mass culture that they saw as shallow and unfulfilling.
It's interesting that they were having these debates in the 1960s because you see similar concerns being raised in the U.S. and Europe around that time. It was a period of a lot of social and cultural upheaval.
Yeah, it was a time of questioning everything. And in Chile, these debates about the role of philosophy in the university became increasingly intertwined with the political climate, especially as the country moved toward the Allende administration in 1970.
It's like the lines between philosophical positions and political allegiances were getting blurred.
Absolutely. And this created a lot of tension within the philosophical community, which reflected the broader polarization happening in society.
And philosophical production actually declined during the Allende years.
Yeah, there was a sense of uncertainty and anxiety about the future. The Revista de Filosofía even stopped publishing. But there were still some notable works that came out, like Miles's Idea de la Filosofía in 1970.
But then everything changed with the military coup in 1973.
Yeah, that was a devastating event that had a profound and lasting impact on intellectual life in Chile, including philosophy.
The military regime was determined to reshape Chilean society and politics, and they saw higher education as a key battleground.
Absolutely. They revoked university autonomy, appointed military officers as rectors, closed down entire departments, and purged anyone they deemed to be politically subversive.
And the Department of Philosophy at the University of Chile, being the most prestigious institution for philosophical study, was hit especially hard.
Yeah, it was targeted. Prominent figures like Juan Ravano were arrested and exiled. Others were dismissed from their positions without any due process. The regime even went so far as to appoint relatively unknown but politically sympathetic philosophers to key roles, rather than engaging with the established scholars who had criticized the university reforms.
So it was a deliberate attempt to stifle dissent and control the flow of ideas.
Absolutely. They wanted to impose their own ideology on the universities. And this created an atmosphere of fear and intellectual stagnation.
It must have been incredibly difficult for philosophers to continue their work under such oppressive conditions.
It was. Some tried to keep their heads down and focus on their scholarship, hoping to ride out the storm. Others, like Ravano, were forced into exile. And then there's the case of Jorge Milas, which is particularly tragic.
He initially had some hope that the military intervention might restore his vision of the university as a place for detached intellectual reflection.
Yeah, he thought that maybe they would depoliticize the universities and return them to their traditional role.
But he quickly became disillusioned, right?
Though, yeah. He saw the true nature of the regime and was appalled by their blatant disregard for academic freedom. He started speaking out against the military intervention, arguing that a university under surveillance was not a real university.
And his work took on a darker tone, focusing on the themes of violence and oppression.
Yeah, his book La Violencia y sus Máscaras, co-authored with Edison Otero, is a powerful reflection on the nature of violence in society.
And despite his criticisms, he was eventually removed from his position at Universidad Austral.
Yeah, he was deemed too critical. But he continued to write and defend the idea of the university as a vital space for free thought and intellectual inquiry. His last book, Idea de la Universidad, published shortly before his death in 1982, is a testament to his unwavering commitment to those values.
It's a powerful and moving story. So what about other philosophers? How did they navigate this period?
Some, like Felix Schwartzman, Carla Cordua, and Humberto Giannini, managed to continue their work, but they were very careful about what they said publicly. It was a dangerous time to be outspoken.
And the exiled philosophers, like Ravano, had no platform within Chile to share their ideas.
Right, they were silenced. It wasn't until the plebiscite in 1988, which rejected the continuation of military rule, that things began to change.
That was a crucial turning point for Chile, a move back toward democracy.
And it was a turning point for philosophy as well. The end of the dictatorship allowed for a renewal of intellectual life, a return to open debate and critical inquiry.
But the experience of the dictatorship had a lasting impact on Chilean philosophy, didn't it?
It did. Many philosophers who had previously been hesitant to engage directly with political issues now saw the importance of doing so. They realized that philosophy couldn't be separated from the fight for democracy and justice.
And there was a movement away from the universities and toward independent research centers, right?
Yeah, many philosophers felt that the universities were still too compromised, too closely tied to the old regime. They wanted to create spaces where they could do their work without fear of censorship or reprisal.
And these independent centers often fostered more interdisciplinary dialogue, breaking down the traditional barriers between philosophy and other fields.
That's right. There was a sense that philosophy needed to be more connected to the real world, to the issues facing Chilean society.
And we also saw a number of Chilean philosophers going abroad during this period, either because they were forced into exile or because they were seeking opportunities elsewhere.
Yeah, that's an important point. Thinkers like Felix Schwartzman, Carla Cordua, Juan Ravano, and Renato Christi all made significant contributions to philosophy in other countries.
So the legacy of Chilean philosophy was spread around the world.
Exactly. Now, since the return to civilian rule in 1990, Chilean philosophy has faced a new set of challenges.
Like shifting national priorities that sometimes favor more practical fields over the humanities.
Yeah, that's been an issue. And there's also the fragmentation that's come with the proliferation of new private universities, many of which don't have the same resources or commitment to philosophy as the older, more established institutions.
And there have even been attempts to reduce or eliminate philosophy from the secondary school curriculum.
Yeah, those efforts have been met with a lot of resistance from the philosophical community. They see it as a vital subject for developing critical thinking skills and promoting a deeper understanding of the world.
But despite these challenges, Chilean philosophy has continued to flourish in the democratic era.
It has. There's been a lot of exciting work being done by a new generation of philosophers, and we've also seen the posthumous publication of important works by figures like Millais and Ravano.
So, looking back at this whole journey, how would you characterize the overall trajectory of Chilean philosophy?
What stands out for me is the way it's been so closely intertwined with the country's history and political development. It's a story of constant engagement, of philosophers grappling with the big questions of their time, whether those questions were about national identity, the relationship between faith and reason, the nature of scientific knowledge, the challenges of modernity, or the struggle for democracy and justice.
So it's not just a history of abstract ideas. It's a history of ideas in action, ideas that have shaped and been shaped by the lived experience of the Chilean people.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes it so fascinating. And for our listeners, especially those with a background in philosophy, I think there's a lot to learn from this Chilean experience.
It shows how philosophical traditions are not developed in isolation, but are always in conversation with the social and political realities of their time and place.
Yeah, it's a reminder that philosophy is not just an ivory tower pursuit. It has the potential to engage with the real world and make a difference in people's lives.
And on that note, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. Given this rich and often turbulent history, what unique perspectives and contributions might Chilean philosophy offer to contemporary global philosophical discussions?
That's a great question. I think Chilean philosophers have a lot to say about the challenges of modernity, the relationship between individual freedom and social responsibility, the importance of democracy and human rights, and the ongoing search for meaning and purpose in a complex and ever-changing world.
And perhaps their experience, with its dramatic shifts between academic specialization and intense political engagement, can offer valuable insights into the enduring and complex relationship between intellectual life and political power.
It's a relationship that we all need to be thinking about, especially in these uncertain times. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Chilean philosophy. We encourage you to check out the bibliography and related entries in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for more information.
It's been a fascinating journey. Thanks for listening.